And kia ora, welcome from New Zealand. This is Sally Mabelle or Azima, and today I'm talking with Arjuna, Dr. Ben Zion Weiss in Sydney, Australia. Welcome, Arjuna.
Thank you. Good to see you all the way over there.
Yeah, very good to see you too, and I'm really pleased that we were able to work up this interview just a few days before your book launch. Arjuna has just written a new book called Integral Spirituality Essays in Social Ecology and Integral Consciousness. And he's got a book launch coming up in a few days. Um, so, Arjuna, I'll tell you a little bit about Arjuna before I start asking him questions, okay? He is a community educator in social ecology, meditation, yoga, drama, English as a second language, cross cultural conflict and nonviolence training, and he has lectured and tutored at the University of Western Sydney and consulted for multicultural conflict resolution and intercultural programs. His PhD research is on anti-racism, drama education for youth and youth workers. Arjuna is also a mentor in the Dances of Universal Peace and a guide in the Sufi Ruhaniyat International. So there's a lot more I could say about him, but let's get him talking about the book. So tell us, Arjuna, a little bit, what is the book about?
Well, the book's about spirituality and integrating that into our lives. And integral spirituality comes out of the research that's gone on in the last 20, 30 years around how we have to bring things together rather than having them all separate. Social ecology is the discipline that I've been teaching in, and that's a discipline that I feel is incredibly relevant to this time because it brings together all the aspects that we need to understand what's going on in this very complex and confused world, because it brings in the social, the ecological, the spiritual, the psychological, indigenous ways of looking at things, sense of place. And it's a very interdisciplinary, holistic discipline. And
Now,
it's
who's the book for? Who is the book for?
for inspiring people to have some hope at a time when there's a lot of darkness out there, according to the media. It's showing that there's lots of positive things going on at deep levels, and there are lots of groups like cultural creatives and blessed unrest and different ways in which people are actually changing the world. But that's not usually in mainstream media. So the idea is to bring in other ideas. And it's basically a philosophy book, but it's very practical. It's about action in the world, actions I've taken, actions I've been involved in with students who've worked with other activists. And it's really a very holistic way of living life. And that's what I'm hoping to encourage people to do.
Okay, so when somebody reads this book, so say I'm going to read your book, what will I go away with? Will I be propelled into action? How's it going to impact me?
Well, the hope would be that it would inspire you to, I mean, in social ecology, we always begin with ourselves. Look at, know thyself, look inside, look what's going on. And then look at what our relationships are. Our relationships with our family, our community, with the earth, with the animals, the trees, all our big relationships, both socially and ecological, and also with the cosmos, which relates to our spirituality. And when we're coming from that place, what we've found in social ecology is that people are very empowered to act, even when things look pretty gloomy. The work of people like Joanna Macy, for example, shows that, time for connections. Yeah.
Wonderful. So, are you going to be lecturing on this topic in Sydney, or what do you do with it?
Well, I recently decided to leave the university. Sadly, social ecology at Western Sydney is not very well. Australian universities are now privileging science and technology over everything else,
Mm.
and the humanities subjects are being less and less included, and they're much more expensive to do. So I decided to leave the university context. I'm working mainly within community contexts with groups. In Sydney, we've got a group like the Sydney Alliance, and there's a Voices for Peace group based on Jewish cultural stuff. There's all different groups that I'm part of. I'm looking at more community ways of engaging with people and sharing these ideas. And hopefully also the idea is that it'll empower other people to take action and look at how they can also have an influence in their own community. So that's the idea, was really to inspire people to see that it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot of positive things that I've experienced and other people are doing that's under the radar, as Paul Hawkins says, and he wrote a book called Blessed Unrest, which talks about this is, Blessed Unrest is a research on NGOs in the world. There's 1 to 2 million NGOs, and it's the biggest movement in human history, but it's all under the radar. There's phenomena like cultural creatives, who also make up something like 35% of all OECD countries, according to Irvin Laszlo, who studies this. And again, it's under the radar, so we're not aware of how much really positive things are going on.
So
and I'm sure that...
do you put a lot of these resources into the book so that people can find them?
Well, the book's a collection of papers and essays and talks that I've given over the last 20, 30 years that have inspired positive reactions, and there's a lot of resources there. There's video possibilities, there's books. And the idea is to really, social ecology is a very holistic discipline, and it comes into the integral consciousness. And that's really the area that I got into through working with Indigenous people in Australia and Pacific. I came up with this idea of an ecology of culture. I realised that within Indigenous cultures, there's no separation between the ecology and the culture. In migratory cultures, like the one I've come from, there's a separation because we've internalised cultures from elsewhere, and then we try to reproduce the ecology from somewhere else. And that can work in places. Southeast Australia, it's worked. A lot of the other parts of Australia, it's been a disaster. It's turned Australia into more of a desert. It's created salination, all sorts of problems. So the thing is that what I'm trying to do is just encourage people to connect with their own ecology, their own bioregion, and recognise that the more we can make our culture and our ecology come together and harmonise, the more it actually helps us to live more fully. And then that led me to the work of a fellow called Jean Gebser, who wrote a book called The Ever-Present Origins, and it's about integral consciousness. And one of my mentors for my PhD said I needed to look at Jean Gebser's work when I mentioned an ecology of culture. And indeed, this is what he calls integral consciousness. It's bringing together the social, the ecological, and it's like, in the Western world, there's a war going on between the humanities and the sciences. In Australia just recently, the government says they're going to charge twice as much for humanities and make sciences and technology cheaper to do at university. So it's like the war is still going on, and the point is that that's why we can't solve problems, because we've got ideas on one hand and people and values and human things, and then we've got the scientific information on the other, and people know there's all this scientific stuff happening, but they don't know how to communicate it to people. And the point about social ecology, it actually brings the humanities and the sciences together, and that's a part of an integral consciousness, and an ecology of culture does that. And Gebser spent a lot of time looking at how this had been the human process. He actually didn't even want to use evolution because he was looking at Nazi Germany, and there they were saying they were very evolved. But in fact, he talks about a mutation. So we've gone through different structures of consciousnness, and each one has brought a positive quality at the beginning, but then become deficient or negative, and then a new one was needed. And it starts with the archaic consciousness, which was when we were part of nature, then the magical, which I put about 70,000 years ago. We come into the indigenous ways of being in the world. Then about 12,000 years ago, after another ice age, these things happen after ice ages, we came into the mythical consciousness with the agricultural revolution. And then at the Renaissance, around that time, we came into what he called the mental consciousness. And again, each one was positive, and the mental consciousness was fantastic then. But within time, by the Industrial Revolution, slavery, exploitation of women, of children, so on, and raw materials, so-called, all these things, it became deficient. And now we need a new structure of consciousness, and Gebser came up with this idea that this would be what he called the integral consciousness. And he learnt that after going to India and meeting Sri Aurobindo, who had developed integral yoga. He went to the Deer Park, had a Satori experience, an enlightenment experience, and then went back to Switzerland. And he was working at the Jung Institute because it took a while before people recognised how important he really was. And so he was basically wanting to bring in this new integral consciousness, which is a way of going back to the origins. So that's why he calls the book The Ever-Present Origins.
Okay.
Now, this is...
Now, is this integral consciousness, is that the same, is that the guy Gebner, you said?
Gebser.
Gebser. Is he the same, is that the same concept as Ken Wilber's integral?
Not exactly. Ken Wilber discovered Gebser in the 80s, and then he developed his own theory around it. And I mean, there's a lot of very useful things have grown out of Wilber, particularly transpersonal psychology. Mm-hmm. And he has a very good four-quadrant analysis that I've used as well. But the thing about Wilber is that he's still very mental consciousness. It's still very analytical, whereas Gebser was truly integral. And what the difficulty about integral consciousness is we don't know what it is because we're not there yet. We're on our way. It's like in the Sufi. We say towards the
we're
going towards an integral.
So what's an example? Okay, so if give us a practical example of how we can bring integral consciousness to our communities. So in a real way, if I was going to make my community more aware of integral consciousness, what would I do?
Well, for me, the dances of universal peace are an example of integral consciousness. Mm-hmm. They're universal. They cover all the different cultures. They bring East, West, and Indigenous together. And they involve community, they involve sacred phrases from all over the planet, all throughout time. I mean, a very good example that comes to mind is a group called the Pachamama Alliance that I was involved in. I got involved through one of my students and then became a facilitator in it. And the Pachamama Alliance is a group that's formed out of a dream that was had by the Achua people, Amazon indigenous people from the Ecuadorian Amazon, and some people in California. They both dreamed of each other, and then this other fellow brought them together. And this organisation has saved their piece of rainforest. Since 1992, it was earmarked for petrol exploration, but they've still saved it. And it involves the indigenous way of looking at it. It involves nature, the archaic way. It involves the stories that we need to tell each other and stories of empowerment, for example. And it involves developing a real holistic way of being. And they have these three principles to be sustainable, ecologically sustainable, socially just, and spiritually connected. Those three principles I see as being integral.
It sounds great. Now, you mentioned that you're doing work with youth and youth groups. I'm wondering, how can we empower youth to take this? You know, in the Dances of Universal Peace community and the Sufi communities, we've got lots of folks in their 60s and their 70s. And how do we get the youth involved in this?
Well, it's an interesting thing. We also have a similar challenge in Australia in we got one or two young people, but mainly it's older people. But the way I get youth involved is through drama games, storytelling. And like 20 years ago when I was working in an Aboriginal school, we did a lot of anti-racism drama. And they could relate to that. It was very improvised. It wasn't based on text. It was very much looking at their life experiences of how they deal with racism. And it was based on a program that grew out of a form called Theatre of the Oppressed, or Forum Theatre. A Brazilian educator developed that, and it was very effective because young people were setting up their own conflicts and looking at how to de-escalate them. And then they were peer teaching younger kids. So this was very integrated into a school or a community setting. And it was so successful, I ended up training teachers all over New South Wales in this program, working with drama, conflict resolution and anti-racism. And it's called Cooling Conflicts. There's even a website that they finally set up for it. And it's one example of how engaging young people in looking at their issues, their problems, and how they can deal with them more creatively. And that's what I've been doing as a youth worker and as a teacher for many years. So that's where a lot of these ideas burst themselves, because I could see that, often young people have terrific ideas, but they don't know how to channel the energy. And so basically, it's working in that area, and I'm planning to do some more work in the Aboriginal community. I have some connections that I established about 20 years ago, and I'm wanting to go back in there with the Black Lives Matter stuff happening here, because we've had so many Aboriginal deaths in custody that's still not been addressed by the government and police. And so but the main thing that happened when I was working with these young people, it was empowering them. It was giving them pride in who they were. And it was challenging the shame that comes out of racism. So often people feel a lot of shame, and in Aboriginal communities, when you're working with young Aboriginal people, they're often saying, "Oh, shame, shame." And I realised when I talked to one of the artists involved in our program, that I was in another organisation, that the shame comes out of the racism. And it's like, how do we then turn that around and make people feel proud of their culture? And gradually in Australia, it's happening. I think New Zealand has done so much better in terms of Maori culture. And that's why I kept coming to New Zealand to do Maori dances, because I feel like it's been a model for what we need to do here. And now we do have a couple of Aboriginal dancers, and I've been working with an Aboriginal elder, Uncle Noel Butler, and we've been developing stuff here as well. And it's really making a difference.
Great. Well, I hope you can do one of your Aboriginal dances with us maybe next week, possibly.
Well,
Or when January.
it's very much a communal thing. It's actually hard to. I mean, I can do it and demonstrate it,
Right.
but
Right.
it doesn't take the form of a normal dance of universal peace. It's sort of like you form these groups, and each group becomes like an animal, which is part of the Aboriginal way of dancing. But
Interesting. So, tell us about this book launch coming up in a few days, isn't it?
yes, well, it's coming up on next Saturday, and I'm excited because it'll be an opportunity to promote the book, to give people a chance to look at it and to read bits of it. And in the book, there are chapters that are particularly relevant, like to the Rouhaniat, because there was a desert journey with Loudon, and 19 of us went off on this desert caravan to Central Australia. There's retreats we've done with Uncle Noel Butler on this Aboriginal land, which sadly got burnt out in the bushfires earlier this year. And I just recently went to see him, and he's okay, but it's obviously a big shock, and he has to rebuild. There's a chapter on my own dance leading journey, because we used to do dances, for example, in Martin Place in the city for International Day of Peace, 21st of September. And we'd get people to dance from different schools. We had all those prayer flags from the Peace Pole societies. And, there was a lot of really positive things that I've been able to do through the Dancers Outreach. There's a chapter on universal Sufism, which grew out of Hazrat Nai Khan and Murshid Sam, that I've been practicing. And the other parts of the book are very much about projects like the one I did for an anti-racism radio show, which was with these predominantly Aboriginal kids, some Pacific Islanders and some European kids. So it was very powerful, because often engaging kids in an Aboriginal context is very hard, because they've been so traumatised by Western education, and we haven't been very effective, except maybe in Victoria, in engaging the communities. We could never get parents, for example, to come to the school. But when we put on a production like Stand Your Ground, which we did as a community theatre thing, all these parents turned up for the first time to see their kids performing. And we had rap dance, raps, and we had break dancing, we had all sorts of youth culture stuff that they developed. And it was really empowering for them, because they felt like somebody was taking notice of them. Yeah. And often they don't feel. In Australia, the Aboriginal situation's been pretty chronic until the last maybe 10, 15 years. It's begun to start having an influence now, that we actually do have these Indigenous people. Unlike New Zealand, we've never had a treaty, and we've almost had treaty a couple of times, and there was a big meeting a couple of years ago, and then the government just said, oh no, we don't want to know about that. So that we're really in a very different situation to I think, in Aotearoa in terms of like the Indigenous people. And part of my work has been to try and empower them and work with them, and work with Aboriginal elders in a way that can, be useful.
And so you have do you have a lot of these stories of what you've done in the book?
It's all stories of what I've done. It's
Oh, it's
really
all stories of what you've done. Okay.
story of what I've done. Then I was presenting at a conference. Like, we actually did a series of workshops on the integral consciousness and spiritual ecology. There's a wonderful book by Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, edited by Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, on spiritual ecology that has essays from people like Piaget and Joanna Macy and Thomas Berry, and like that inspired me to do a series of workshops with one of my former social ecology students on integral consciousness and spiritual ecology. And we did that workshop actually in this space, this Peace and Meditation Centre I'm sitting in right now. And it was really successful. People really moved a lot of stuff through that. And then we presented a paper, a sustainability conference paper in social ecology at Western Sydney about 5 years ago. And we wrote a paper that we presented, and so that's one of the chapters. And then, as I say, there's chapters from other conferences where I've presented on drama education, on drama yoga, on different aspects to do with cultural creatives, like a talk I gave to the Theosophical Society in Sydney that became a paper on cultural creatives. So they're all positive ways in which we can, it's encouraging people to find their own, because it's not something that you can take from someone else directly, but you can be inspired to explore in your own world. And that's why I say,
so where do people get a copy? How do they get a copy of this?
well, it's available through Lulu Press. I mean, that's
Hold
what
it
it
up. Oh, there you go. Wow, nice.
and it's available through Lulu Press, who are in America. And if you go to the Lulu Press website, and you can just put in integral spirituality, and you get.
Comes up. So is that lulupress.com?
Yes, that's right.
All right, so
Yeah.
lulupress.com, they can get it. And
Yeah.
how do people contact you if they want to know more about your workshops and your work, and they want to explore this integral spirituality and integral consciousness, social ecology? If they want to know more, how do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, I've got my email is arjunab@bigpond.net.au. So it's Arjuna, my Sufi name, B, because there's a lot of Arjunas in Big Pond.
Okay.
I put a B there, which is in,
Arjuna B
at bigpond.net.au.
at bigpond.net.au. Okay.
And I've got a blog, which is Social Ecology Sydney.
Social Ecology Sydney. Great.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And then a number of Facebook pages that I'm managing as well.
Excellent. Did you want to say something about your book launch on the 22nd, or?
Well, basically, what I'm going to read bits of the book, and I've got Nicola, who's a student that I co-led the workshop with. She's going to give a bit of introduction about her perspective on it, because we were going to publish it originally for this conference, and then we decided we wanted to do it separately. So it's a few years later. So anyway, so she'll talk a little bit, I'll talk, I'll read, I'll probably sing a song at the beginning. We've got to start with the song like you do in New Zealand. And basically, encourage some discussion about the issues that are in the book, which, as I say, are very much about looking at the social, the ecological, the spiritual, and the way in which we can move these. In social ecology, we encourage social activism. It's very much many of people researching it. So just like mine was on anti-racism through drama education. And it's basically a way of bringing together multiple ideas, and that's what integral consciousness is about. It's integrating. Mm-hmm. And it's a time where we need to bring things together, whereas we've been very split in the Western culture, particularly between the sciences and the arts and the mystics, are all separate. And there have been some groups over the years that have brought these together, but it's often still in universities, the humanities and the sciences don't usually talk to each other.
Mm.
I've had the unusual situation of starting off as a chemical engineer. So I was in the scientific world, and then I went and did drama and social ecology later. But I did drama and French and humanities and an arts subject and a master's in theatre studies. So I've gone through both sides, and I've been looking at a much more holistic way of living. And that's what I'm encouraging people to do, because the answers are all there if you just go and look for them.
Well, thank you so much for introducing us to this, and thank you for the work you're doing over there with the dances and with the Sufi Ruhaniyat and all of the great work you're doing. People can read more about you. Is there a website they can go to read more about you? I know you've got Lulu Presses for the book, and you've got...
My blog, Social Ecology Sydney,
Okay.
has got all, like a lot of the articles in the book are actually on my blog. That's where they
Okay.
come.
Oh, okay, good. Excellent.
Social Ecology Sydney, you can look at it there. And there's Facebook pages as well. You can look at my name on Facebook and you'll find me. Yeah, so they're all different ways.
Great.
But really, my blog was the way that I wanted to put this stuff out. But I realised that people don't read blogs in detail. So that's why the book came about, as a way of bringing these ideas together. And when I read through it, it really made a lot of sense. All these different bits of my life have actually come together
Neat.
in the book.
Wonderful. Well, we look forward to seeing it, and I look forward to seeing you next week on Zoom. And thank you very much, everybody. Dr. Ben Zion Weiss, or Arjuna, as we affectionately know him in the Sufi community. And we hope to see you in person in January.
Hopefully, we'll see how things are going in terms of travel.
We
But
say,
thank you very much, Azima. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and thank you for your great questions.
you're welcome. We say here, kakite matewa. See you next time. See you later. Have a good night, and stay well there in this challenging time. We will get through it.
Yes.
Okay.
Breathe too.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.